In this video, I provide an overview of the two key readings on the topic of affective inequality, which is about the emotional responses people have to inequality. So affect simply means our emotional response, about how inequalities can spark anger and indignation, and struggles for greater recognition, respect and dignity, but also is bound up with disrespect and stigmatization. So why are these the key readings for the topic? So inequality results in disrespect and stigmatization, and that can lead people to experience shame and despair, and we've already seen some arguments about this on this unit already. But that can also be a powerful force generating dissent and struggle. And the two key readings considering this from different angles. So Skeggs and Loveday look at the affective experience of inequality from the perspective of class inequalities and stigma, whilst Fleming and colleagues consider how racialized inequalities, racial stigma and discrimination lead people to adopt a range of strategies to manage stigmatization and struggle for respect. So both the readings are looking at struggles over value and being devalued in relationship to class in Britain, race in America. So let's look at the Skeggs and Loveday reading first. Skeggs and Loveday explore how a sample of working class people in Britain responded to dominant discourses that constructed them as deficient because of their lack of economic or cultural capital. And they consider the sample's emotional or affective responses to being stigmatised, to being seen as useless or deficient. Now, these affective responses included bitterness, anger and resentment, because these people felt unfairly blamed and judged and wrongly valued. Now, for Skeggs and Loveday, capitalism and the inequality it creates inevitably positions people as having unequal value. And they argue that's because capitalism only sees exchange value in people. And what they mean by that is that capitalism only really values people for what they are worth in the market. So the idea here is that our society only value people in terms of their ability to acquire different levels of capitals, chiefly economic or educational success. But class inequality also gives people very unequal access to economic and cultural rewards, and so very uneven recognition. So because so much emphasis in our society is on exchange value or a market view of recognition, working class people who don't have as much economic or cultural capital as other groups are often stigmatised as lacking value and being personally deficient. So Skeggs and Loveday argue that their sample felt they were blamed and held responsible for their situation, with their lack of success seen as a result of bad culture, faulty psychology, or their lack of moral worth. So by creating subjects of unequal value, whilst at the same time as creating uneven access to what is valued, class inequality, they argue, generates disrespect, humiliation and shame for subordinate groups. But Skeggs and Loveday argue stigmatised groups don't simply swallow this or take it uncritically, because being judged as lacking value also generates anger and resentment. And Skeggs and Loveday argue that anger, bitterness and resentment are legitimate responses to class relations, to being recognised as valueless and judged unjustly by those considered undeserving of authority. Their research indicates that people kick back against their devaluation. They resist it. How? Well, by generating alternative ways of making them feel themselves feel valued, by emphasising different ways of valuing people, which are about dignified relationality and making their lives livable. So this is an argument that working class people engage in struggles over value to resist being devalued. So what are these alternative sources of value and respect? Well, Skeggs and Loveday's respondents saw respect as legitimately deriving from loyalty, from care for others, from community mindedness, from fairness and kindness. What Skeggs and Loveday call person value as opposed to exchange value. They argue that these alternative sources of value and respect were a reaction against and rejection of what they call the dominant symbolic order, in which people's value is only judged for what they are worth on the market. That dominant symbolic order was a set of values which their respondents saw as being characterised as selfishness, greed and envy. So Skeggs and Loveday argue that it was through care, loyalty and affection that people found alternative routes to valuing themselves and each other. They often lived in deprived communities, but they felt that there were communities that had loyalty to each other, that rallied around to support each other when times were tough, and they valued that. So for Skeggs and Loveday, this means that ordinary people, and particularly disadvantaged groups, have different understandings of value, of what matters and what counts, which differs from dominant or hegemonic understandings of value focused on exchange value. And they think these alternative values can provide a basis for resistance and social struggle. Now, their account suggests that there is very incomplete acceptance of hegemonic or dominant values amongst subordinate groups, because the feelings of bitterness, unfairness and anger experienced by those who fail, if you like, in the terms of capitalist values, prompt them to struggle against their devaluation, in the process generating critique and alternative sources of value. Now here, Skeggs and Loveday also identify limitations with Bourdieu's model of class, because they think that Bourdieu's emphasis on how people internalise dominant values can't really explain how their sample managed to claim a personal value for themselves when dominant values saw them as not having value. So their account is focused on how class inequalities shape questions of respect, recognition, and the value or stigma placed on different groups. But of course, struggles for respect are also shaped by other kinds of inequalities. Fleming, Lamont, and Welburn look at this in relationship to racial inequalities and stigma. So Fleming and et al., Fleming and colleagues, their studies of 150 middle class and working class African Americans, which explores the various ways in which their sample navigated and responded to racism and racial stigmatization. What do they mean by stigmatization? Well, their sample saw racism as a defilement of the self, seeing themselves as over-scrutinised, overlooked, underappreciated, misunderstood and disrespected, so stigmatisation in that sense. So the sample felt over-scrutinised when, for example, their supervisors kept a closer eye on them than other white workers, when shop assistants followed them around a store, when passers-by adopted a suspicious stance about their presence in a white space. They talked about being misunderstood when people misinterpreted their actions, for example, when they were seen as being aggressive when they really didn't feel they were being. And they talked about being disrespected when they weren't treated with dignity or weren't seen as being of the same status as others in social spaces. They spoke of their pain and anger about feeling excluded or treated unfairly, which drew on moral ideas about fairness, dignity and rights. But how did the sample respond to their stigmatisation and their pain? And the study seeks to address a gap in the literature, because they argue while there has been other research on how stigmatised groups manage their stigma, they argue there's no, until their study, there wasn't really a systematic survey of the range of strategies that people use and how people's social situation can direct people to use some strategies over others. So their sample didn't respond in the same ways, and that's the interesting angle of their study. So Fleming and colleagues identify a number of what they call tools for recognition their sample used to combat stigmatisation and discrimination, and they see two main categories of these tools: education and managing the self. The first approach, education, is concerned primarily with managing perception of the external self or your social categorisation. And that included strategies such as challenging racism when it was encountered, or sometimes teaching the ignorant, so telling people about the kind of stereotypes that people were using. The second approach, management of the self, was about self-identification and self-protection. So projecting an image of oneself that was positive or conforms to out-group norms to gain recognition, but also self-protection through emphasising other valued aspects of your identity. So for some of the middle class sample, emphasising your professional identity over your racial identity because that gave you more respect. The authors see managing the self as a strategy that can be motivated by various factors: the desire to build positive relationship with others, the need to preserve psychological resources, and the wish to achieve professional success whilst minimising the impact of racial struggles. Managing the self includes a range of tactics aimed at deflecting conflict and maintaining a sense of dignity in the face of stigma rather. So let's think about some of these strategies in greater detail. They identify two modalities of response to stigma: confronting stigma or deflating conflict. So deflating conflict meant choosing to ignore, accept, forgive, tolerate, manage anger, walking away because it wasn't worth you confronting it, or joking about the situation to trouble it slightly but not in a confrontational way. Confrontation, by contrast, meant challenging and naming racism and discrimination explicitly, speaking out when they felt something unfair was happening. So sometimes people sought to minimise conflict, but also to undermine stereotypes by emphasising their own competence, intelligence or respectability. Sometimes they used humour to deflate racism. Sometimes they responded by asserting the moral superiority of their own cultural group, by feeling that they were better than the racists, but also by choosing the higher ground, by not, for example, responding with anger or violence. And sometimes they responded by confronting racism through personally objecting, by saying, no, hang on, that's not fair, that's not right, but also through legal challenges or even collective protest. So there was a range of strategies and practical tactics to manage stigma and to try and gain respect. But what determined the approach? Why did people choose some tactics over others? And Fleming and colleagues argue that we can see a range of reasons why people chose different tactics. It was partly about how people interpreted their situation, what they call everyday meaning making, but also a range of factors in people's social situation which structured how they responded. And that was partly about questions of safety and risk, but also about the resources that people had access to. Those resources included cultural values, the values of the American dream and the civil rights movement, as well as the shared history and identity of African Americans, as well as moral ideas and more liberal neoliberal values. But the finding of the study highlight the complexities of responses to racism among African Americans. While confrontation was often seen as the best strategy, the sample often didn't feel able to do this. And there are also other approaches that involved self-management and education, which also avoided confrontation. Having access to legal resources, not only personally, the money to hire a lawyer, for example, but also having legal rights, such as the Civil Rights Act in the USA, affected people's willingness to confront rather than to deflect or walk away. But stigmatisation is also a painful and humiliating process, and the sample were also focused on managing their situation to protect themselves and to maintain their dignity. So both studies suggest that people's sense of grievance and critical awareness of their situation is shaped by their emotional response to how they feel about disrespect and stigma. People couldn't respond neutrally. They were always aware of disrespect and stigma. So one of the things to think about is whether this supports or undermines the argument we've seen in previous topics that people internalise, naturalise or normalise inequality. Can you do that when you're being stigmatised? But also, why do people sometimes try to deflate stigmatisation rather than confront it? And what other ways might people combat, resist or respond to stigmatisation? It's sometimes suggested that the effective experience of inequality can cause people to rear up against their situation, to protest or dissent, and say, no, hang on, I'm not taking that. Do you think it can bring about real change, though? And we'll discuss that in the workshop.